Good evening. We are so glad that you have joined us this Sunday. As always, we want to spend some time reading God's Word. So tonight we're going to turn to the book of 1 Samuel, reading from chapter 8, verses 4 to 9, then verses 19 to 20, then chapter 13, verses 6 to 9, and verses 13 and 14, and finally chapter 15, verses 10 to 11, and verse 22. Let's read God's Word together. Then all of the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. The thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them, and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. When the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes and in rocks and in tombs and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He waited 7 days for the appointed time by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord, who have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. The word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. Samuel said, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams.
Let us pray. Lord, I want to thank you for helping us set up these online sessions, and that we can still find a way to show your love and your word through these sessions as a blessing. I want to pray for Philip as he takes us in his sermon just after this, and that the lessons he teaches us will stay with us in the coming weeks. I want to pray for the safety of the people listening to this, as well as their friends and their families, and that we'll all do what we can to stay as safe as possible in these difficult times. I want to pray for the other leaders as well, as they join me in trying to find the best way to present your word to these young people, to have the best impact with them. I pray these things in your name. Amen.
Well, I'm sure we all remember a time when our parents have given us a chore around the house, and instead of doing it with a thankful and gracious heart, We've maybe moaned, complained and grumbled. Perhaps you're like me, you've hoovered around things instead of lifting them and hoovering under them to get the job done quicker. Or maybe you've been asked to do the dusting and you've chosen to ignore certain ornaments that you know your mum would definitely want dusted. Cutting corners and taking shortcuts is a short-term solution, and while we may think we're being clever, we forget that the Lord sees and knows all. Maybe your mum won't notice that you have half-heartedly did the hoovering, or maybe your school teacher won't notice how you cut corners on that homework. But we must realise that half-hearted obedience is in fact disobedience. Last week we were thinking about how Israel lost the Ark of the Covenant. We saw how God's people took their eyes off the Lord and they faced the consequences. Well, as we turn to the next part of this story, we will see that when it comes to following God, half-hearted obedience is still obedience. Some weeks ago we were studying the story of Hannah. Remember, she was a married woman who wasn't able to conceive. So she went to the Lord and prayed that he would show her mercy and that he would also bless her. And the Lord answered her prayer. Hannah would give birth to a son called Samuel. And Samuel grew up to become one of Israel's greatest prophets. He was God's messenger who spoke on behalf of God to his people. However, in chapter 8 and verse 5, we're told that Samuel's sons didn't follow in the footsteps of their father. Instead of serving God, they rejected to live the life that God had called his people to live. And the people of Israel saw the rebellion of Samuel's sons as an opportunity. Because look at verse 5 again. It says, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." The people of Israel have come to God's prophet and they have demanded a king to rule over them. This request wasn't uncalled for because Scripture shows us that it was always God's plan for a man to one day sit on a throne over his people. So the people's request for a king wasn't necessarily bad or wrong, but the heart behind the request was completely misplaced. Notice why they wanted a king. Listen again, it says, "Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." See, God's people desired to be like the nations around them. God had called his people to be separate from the world. He had called Abraham out of his family to obey him in faith. He redeemed the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. He gave him his law in the wilderness to govern their nation, their worship and their behaviour. You see, God's people were to be unique. They were to be set apart, different and radical. See, by following and living for the Lord, God's people would stand out and be a blessing to the world. God's people have now decided that instead of being different, they would prefer to be like everyone else. Maybe you're the same. Maybe when you're with your friends throughout the week, you don't want to be the odd one out because you're a follower of Jesus Christ. So you decide to act differently. You say and do things in order to fit in and feel accepted, even though you know it's wrong. You're just so afraid and even ashamed of standing out and being different because of your faith. You just want to be like everyone else. Well, that's how the people felt as they came to Samuel. They desired to be like everyone else. However, there's something else wrong with Israel's request because by demanding a king to rule over them, God's people were rejecting God as their king. They simply didn't want God to rule over their lives anymore. You see, God was being relegated from his throne and replaced by a human king. in sport when a club isn't performing well or getting good results. It can be because the players have stopped playing for the manager. They no longer want the manager to rule over them. So instead they send a message saying that they want a change. Well, that's what's happening here. God's people want God out. Even though He's the one that has provided for them, fought for them, and ruled over them since the exodus of Egypt. You see, there was nothing wrong with God's performance record because it was perfect. Yet the people wanted God replaced. God's people are reflecting the problem of mankind. It's the problem that stems from Adam and Eve in the garden when they desired to be God and king over their lives. You see, there are two ways to reject God. Number one is to reject Him outright. The other is to claim you follow Him, but you don't truly depend on Him. For so many of us, we claim we followers of Jesus. Yet when we compare our words to our actions, they don't match up. Instead, they highlight the differences and highlight our unfaithfulness and disobedience to God and His Word. Well, this second form of rebellion is expressed whenever you insist on several other things being present in your life before you can feel secure. For example, it's easier to trust God when everything you think you need is right in front of you. When school is going well, or when your relationships are good, and when the people in your life are healthy. But when one of those things is missing, when your plans don't fall into place, you sometimes get insecure, anxious, or unhappy. You see, Samuel takes the people's request to God in verse 6. And we naturally expect God to respond in a certain way, to be disappointed and angry. But He doesn't respond like that, because look at verses 7 and 9. It says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." See, God hears the people's wish. But He doesn't say, no, you're not getting a king. I'm your God and your king. No, instead He grants their wishes. So in chapter 10 of 1 Samuel, Samuel anoints a man called Saul. And Saul becomes the first king of Israel. The people have finally got what they wanted. And Saul was an impressive individual. He looked like a king and he had all the qualities of a ruler. So the people were understandably happy. They now had a king who would lead them, provide for them, and protect them. However, despite looking like a king, Saul's faithful leadership was skin deep, because Saul had that same heart condition. Israel was facing another battle with their biggest enemies, the Philistines. And this was Saul's first test to prove that he had what it took to lead and to protect the people of Israel. And Saul was ordered by Samuel to stay and wait for him for 7 days so that he could offer sacrifices for the battle. But as Saul waited, he watched his troops deserting him. In chapter 13, verses 6 to 7, Saul became desperate. How on earth could he lead his army to victory when they were deserting from the battlefield? And that's why in verse 9 we see Saul taking matters into his own hands by deciding to ignore Samuel's instructions and perform the sacrifices himself. You see, Saul's impatience with Samuel showed his lack of faith in the Lord. Samuel arrives and he realizes that Saul has not followed his instructions. He simply failed the test in trusting in the Lord. Saul recognised that he's made the wrong decision, and that's why he starts to make excuses for his actions. But instead of blaming himself, Saul blames Samuel for not coming soon enough. Samuel listens, and then he responds in verses 13 to 14. By disobeying Samuel, Saul disobeyed the Lord. The people's foolish request for a king actually resulted in a king who made a foolish decision on behalf of his people. You see, disobedience towards God always involves a consequence. Like Adam and Eve before him, Saul faced the consequences of his sin in verse 14. It says, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Saul's lack of faith led to disobedience and consequences. His reign as king would no longer be blessed. There would be no dynasty for him and his descendants. As Saul continued to reign over God's people, in the opening verses of chapter 13, God spoke through Samuel to Saul, telling him to kill all of the Amalekites and their animals. You'd think that Saul had learnt from his mistakes, that he would faithfully carry out God's commandments. Saul was given clear instructions. Do not spare the Amalekites. Saul destroyed everyone and everything, but he spared the king. He kept the best of the animals to use as sacrifices to the Lord. You see, deep down Saul believed that he had done the right thing, and yet he was guilty of being disobedient to the Lord. When Samuel confronted him for his disobedience, Saul insisted that he had obeyed, and he couldn't understand how he had fallen short of God's commands. You see, to Samuel, partial obedience was still disobedience. And as we reflect on this story tonight, we should ask ourselves as disciples of Jesus Christ, am I truly obedient to God and His Word? Is there a part of my life that I refuse to give up and to surrender in order to be faithful and obedient? Maybe you're struggling with thoughts, or the words that you say, or the decisions and actions that you make. You know what you're doing, and you know it's wrong, and yet you continue to do it. Our fallen human hearts lead us to make decisions that are wrong and sinful. And yet sometimes we believe the lie that if we disobey in one area of our lives, that we can make it up in another. You might think it's okay to watch certain things on the internet or on television because you do a quiet time throughout the week. But no matter how small or insignificant we think those sins are, it doesn't excuse them, because all sin is rebellion against God. It's like the student who tries to justify being in an unhealthy and ungodly relationship by saying that he or she is trying to share Christ with that other person. As Christians, we must live in obedience to God and His Word. When we read and study our Bibles, we mustn't simply pick and choose the bits that we are obedient to, because God calls us to a life of obedience. This may seem impossible to do. We will struggle and we will fail to be faithful disciples at home, at school, at college, work and university. However, when we fail, we must turn to the one who was obedient, not only in life, but also to the point of death. That is why we must turn to Jesus. We must turn to Him, asking Him not only to forgive us, but to give us the strength to turn away from our sin, in order that we may be obedient to our true King. If you don't know Jesus as your Lord and Saviour, well, From the story, I think you're reminded that there are two ways to live. The first way is to reject God as your ruler and king by trying to run life your way without him. And you might think that depending on the God of the Bible to direct your life and dictate how you live is completely oppressive. A life that prevents you from living the kind of life that you would want to live. And while it seems like being king of your life leads to a life of freedom and enjoyment, it ultimately leads to misery and suffering. Well, the second way to live involves taking off your crown and making Jesus Christ not only king of some of your life, but all parts of your life. See, we submit to Jesus because of what he has done through his life, death and resurrection. And that means we must come to him in repentance and faith, turning away from our life of sin and living a life that acknowledges him as the true and ultimate king.